Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop, created for people with diabetes by people who have diabetes, and by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
This week, choosing your diabetes technology can be complicated. Wouldn't it be nice if there was sort of a Consumer Reports for pumps and CGMs? Enter DiabetesWise from people who know it's about more than the hardware.
There's the physical side to wearing it, then there's this mental burden that is related to having to pay attention to it and to think about what's going on, and then there's also the social side that is the distractions and the potential workarounds that you have to come up with in these various settings, whether it's school, work, family, relationships.
That's Korey Hood, who lives with type 1. He's part of the team at Stanford, who, along with the Helmsley Trust, created DiabetesWise. We'll talk about what it is, how it works, and why it is needed. In Tell Me Something Good, the greatest game of Marco Polo ever played, and I find my diabetes doppelganger. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I'm your host, Stacey Simms. So glad to have you along. And I'm really excited about what we're talking about today because I don't know about you, but when we went to pick out our pump for Benny, and I'll tell the story during the interview, it was just overwhelming. And while our educator was fantastic, I really wish we'd had just something to kind of compare and contrast the different types of tech like now exists with DiabetesWise. So we'll get to that and the interview in just a couple of minutes. But, you know, I get so many great emails and messages, and I'm so terrible at reading reviews and sharing this stuff with you. You know, there's all sorts of techniques and strategies for getting people to share more reviews and email you more and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just terrible at that. But I have to share this one with you because it was like getting a message, like a message in a bottle from a time machine. So here's what happened. Casey messaged me. Hi, Stacey. I am sure you get messages like this one all day, every day, but I couldn't resist reaching out. I wanted to reach out and tell you how you impacted my world for the better. My son was diagnosed with type 1 on the 21st of November of 2019. We are soaking in all the new information, trying to get sleep, keep up with our jobs, all while trying to keep our regular life intact. I came across your podcast, and more specifically, the episode titled All About Babies and Toddlers with Type 1 Diabetes. I immediately thought, finally, a podcast discussing everything we have been dealing with lately. Plus, it's run by a type 1 mom. Score! Anyway, long story short, she writes, I listened to it and learned a lot, but that's not why I'm messaging you. I am messaging you because my son's name is Benny, and he was diagnosed just 6 weeks before his second birthday. His sister is 4. If that wasn't enough similarities for you, we are also from Charlotte. They live in Charleston now. I know this might not mean that much to you, but for me, listening to your podcast shifted my world. Listening to your story somehow made me feel not so alone. All I can say is thank you. Thank you for telling your story and putting your life out there for the world to see. It took me a minute. I had to reread it, to be honest with you, because if you're not familiar with our story, my son, Benny, was diagnosed right before he turned 2. His older sister had just turned 5. So it's a very similar story. I mean, they had used to live in Charlotte. It was just this feeling of kinship. I'm not sure. We're still talking. I'm kind of working out the emotions because it is kind of like looking at a time machine. And I'm so grateful for the people that were there for us when Benny was diagnosed and the blogs I read and the people that I talked to. So to be that for somebody else now is really remarkable. So Casey, thank you so much for reaching out. Definitely let's keep in touch. Our Bennies maybe will meet at some point. How much fun would that be? I mean, we go to Charleston every summer. That's where we go to the beach. So I'm really hoping to follow up on this because, man, those connections are really what it's all about for me. It sounds really hokey, but if you've listened to the show for any length of time or met me, I think you'll say that that's the truth. All right. So DiabetesWise coming up in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop, and it is so nice to find a diabetes product that not only does what you need, but also fits in perfectly with your life. OneDrop is that. It's the sleekest looking and most modern meter my family has ever used. And it's not just about the modern meter setup. You can also send your readings to the mobile app automatically and review your data anytime. Instantly share blood glucose reports with your healthcare team. It also works with your Dexcom, Fitbit, or your Apple Watch. Not to mention their awesome test strip subscription plans. Pick as many test strips as you need, and they'll deliver them to your door. OneDrop, diabetes care delivered. Learn more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneDrop logo. My guests this week are Korey Hood, PhD, Professor of Pediatrics and of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Stanford School of Medicine. We did a great episode a while back about the mental burden of wearing devices with Korey. It was really eye-opening for me, and I will link that up on the episode homepage. And we're also talking to Laurel Koester, T1D Program Officer at the Helmsley Trust. I should note, we taped this interview a few weeks ago, so when they talk about things added to the website, some are already there. Now, starting this year, all of our episodes are transcribed on the homepage. Have you checked that out? You can go right to the episode homepage on diabetes-connections.com, scroll down just a little bit, and the whole episode transcript is there so you can read the episode if you prefer. Love to know if you're doing that, so let me know what you think. Here is my interview with Korey and Laurel, and I start out by asking Korey, what is DiabetesWise?
Well, thanks again, Stacey, for having us on, and we're always happy to talk about DiabetesWise. So this is a website that we collaboratively worked on. So I'm a psychologist and clinical researcher, and one of the things that we've noticed in practice and also in research is that people are not always aware of the different device options they have, and I'm not always aware of the different technologies available to them for managing diabetes. And so we wanted to create a resource that was unattached to device manufacturers, to companies, that hopefully is unbiased and can be free, and people can go there and compare different devices and understand a little bit about what other people who are using those devices have thoughts on it. And so we've been doing some collaborative work with the Helmsley Charitable Trust for 4 or 5 years on understanding some of these device and psychological factors related to device use. And so we have support from them and have been working on this for much of the past year and a half.
Laurel, let me ask you, I remember years ago now looking for the insulin pump for my son, who was 2 at the time, and it just seemed overwhelming what was out there. I had no idea how to make a decision. What would I find at DiabetesWise? How would this have helped me?
Sure. Well, one thing I think is really critical about DiabetesWise and what makes it so different from what's out there is the use of personal stories from real people living with diabetes. So, our ultimate goal at the Trust is to help people be aware of all their technology options that are out there and kind of get the inside story and real talk from others living with type 1 about their experiences trying, maybe stopping, maybe trying again, different types of technology. And we found through some market research that we've done is people really, there are kind of 2 groups of people. There's a group of people that, really trust their doctor above everyone else. And then there's other folks that really look to online information sources, like a DiabetesWise, like Beyond Type 1. But there was nothing really focused specifically on technology. And what is really great about DiabetesWise is that it has a short questionnaire at the beginning that basically serves as an algorithm to help see where people are when they come into the site, and then provide suggestions on what device is right for them through the use of these personal stories.
And Laurel, I definitely want to talk more about the Helmsley Trust and why it got involved here. I mean, it's done so much for people with diabetes. But Korey, okay, so you and I have talked before about the mental load people with diabetes carry when we carry when one of these devices is attached, right? And how we kind of don't think about that. I mean, it never occurred to me when Benny was 2.5 and we put the Animus 2020 on him. It never occurred to me to think, well, what's this doing mentally to my child? As a teen, it's kind of easier to see. But can you talk about that a little bit, about how it's beyond, they all work really well. There's not a bad insulin pump out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and what you just mentioned, I think is a great example of why we have to think about this at different stages. And, for somebody who's, like your son, diagnosed at 2, and then the family is adjusting, and the burden around, the mental burden around diabetes management at that point, even devices or not, is really on the parent. And so it's really just a physical side that's on the child. But as they develop, and then, as many of the people with diabetes using these devices are adults, that there's a couple different parts of it that sit in the psychological impact. And one of them that we notice a lot, especially in the teen years, is the social side. And so what kind of attention is drawn to the person based on wearing these devices and having alerts, alarms, having, disruptions in various things that they're doing. And so I think that there's the physical side to wearing it. Then there's this mental burden that is related to having to pay attention to it and to think about what's going on. And then there's also the social side that is, the distractions and the potential, workarounds that you have to come up with in these various settings, whether it's school, work, family, relationships. And so I think that there's a lot to think about, that we often, I think, especially in the clinical care side, we forget that as soon as people leave the clinic, this is what they deal with.
Does this quiz, will this take me through which pump's beeps am I going to actually listen to? Which CGM sensor alarm will I respond to? I'm kind of joking, but, alarm fatigue and things like that are things that really happen. Are those kinds of things taken into account when you're trying to figure out what to choose?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, one of the things that we wanted to do, and I think that this is best illustrated with our CGM comparison tool, which we did a lot of collaborative work with Laurel and her team to make sure that we got it right. And one of the things that we have there are, people can compare the sensors, compare the different devices on whether or not it provides, you have to do calibrations, you have to do finger sticks, but you also know the kind of alerts, whether they're customizable or not. Because, as you just stated, in all the user testing that we did, that is a big concern for people, are these alarms and alerts, and what are the ways that we can at least notify people of them and what it's going to be like. But also in our stories, people talk about that, and they talk about it being disruptive at different times and some of the little tricks that they found to actually help those situations. And so we try to, it's just, essentially just real talk about what it's like to use these different devices.
Laurel, so Korey mentioned your team and some of the research that you had done. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So I think just one to take a step back is, we know the technology works, but how do we get more people to be aware of them, and not only aware, but to then use them and stay on them? And so we know that there are a lot of different factors that kind of play into the space around technology adoption. There's a lot of barriers, but also facilitators out there. And so we really wanted to hone in on, we know there's system level barriers like insurance coverage. So our idea was, let's go directly to people living with diabetes and, just understand their awareness around different technologies. And some of the market research we did was specific to CGM, but we thought, hey, if there are these system level barriers, and we also know that, maybe not all providers actually know about these diabetes technologies, especially if you're talking about primary care providers. And, given the number of people living with type 1 diabetes, but also type 2, and the number of endocrinologists in the U.S., which is not enough to meet demand, there are a lot of people that are seen in the primary care sphere. And primary care providers just, don't have the bandwidth. So some of the market research we did was to we wanted to learn about information sources that people trusted. And the two main points that I alluded to earlier was there's a group of people that really trust a variety of information sources, ranging from their doctor to diabetes bloggers to online community groups. And then there's another group that overwhelmingly trusts their doctor. So for us, this told us that we need different approaches to raising awareness about diabetes technologies, one being through patient-facing resources like DiabetesWise. But I think part of our larger vision is to also, we understand now from this research that we also need to involve healthcare providers. Ultimately, the trust vision is to increase the use of diabetes technologies for people living with diabetes and others who are on intensive insulin therapy, because it really is an effective tool to help improve management.
Korey, I'm curious, as somebody who lives with type 1, and I shouldn't assume, but I was going to say I assume who wears devices. Do you use a CGM or a pump?
I do.
Okay.
Yep.
So
I use probably too many of them.
Wait a minute. So how many are you wearing at the moment?
Oh, no, I'm just exaggerating. But I've tried, I think, everything that's on there.
That leads to my question, which is, do you mind sharing, separate from DiabetesWise, how did you choose? And you can mention brand names if you want to, but I'm curious how you go about, before there was a resource like this, how you went about choosing what devices you would at least try and then wound up with.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that there's probably a few themes about how everybody arrives at this place about devices, and I'll tell you mine, but I think that there are not that many different routes to people getting on devices. And so for me, it was fairly straightforward. This is when, this is 10 years plus now, when the first CGMs came out on the market, and my insurance would pay for it. That was what made me kind of intrigued about it. I've been working in the diabetes space, so I knew that it was coming, and so I wanted to try it because I could. But if I had to pay for that out of pocket, I probably wouldn't have paid for it. I probably wouldn't have done it at that time. So it was accessible to me, which was, an important part. And then also, I liked the idea of something that gave me a continuous, feed of what was going on with my glucose, because I knew from finger sticks, and we still know most people are still using finger sticks, that you miss a lot of the peaks and valleys with those kind of intermittent glucose readings. And so for me, that was appealing, because then I could maybe catch a low. I could, and so just for the management purpose, I think that I was really drawn to it. From the pump side, I've been, you mentioned the Animus earlier, and that was my first pump, and I used it for a long time, and I still have it in my, diabetes museum of devices at home. But it was just because a provider said you should try this. I didn't know really a lot about it, and that was 18, 19 years ago, and I thought, I'll try this, and so I think what I can tell you though, now I currently use the Omnipod with the Dexcom G6 within the Loop system, and so my movement to the Omnipod was just because it was working with that system, and I wanted to give it a try to have tubeless, and for me and my lifestyle and my, when I do physical activity, it's just so much better. And so it's maybe a too long of an answer to your question, but I think it's evolved over time about why I've used devices, and I've been drawn to ones more recently that are smaller, that don't have tubing, and that make it a little bit easier to do the things I like to do, outside of work and family.
Our experience was not exactly similar on choosing an insulin pump in that we were given a lot of choices. And at the time, back in 2006, there were actually more pumps on the market, which is kind of sad to think about. And we chose the Animas 2020 because I felt like of all of the devices that I was shown, it kind of seemed the easiest. I said to my educator, I really said, I need devices, including pump insets and everything else. I need the Venn diagram of idiot proof and does really good, does what it's supposed to do with diabetes. Because I really was so overwhelmed. And that's what we wound up with. And as Benny got older, and every 4 years you're changing and making decisions, we stayed with a tubed pump. We now use the Tandem. One of the reasons we stayed with it is because my son is very responsible, great kid, does well, loses everything. And we felt the Omnipod PDM would be gone in about 30 seconds. But I'm curious, so when you go through the quiz on your pump and sensor and that kind of thing, what kind of questions are you asking? I mean, I should have taken the quiz before I talked to you. Sorry. But I'm wondering, do you want everything attached to your body so you don't lose it? If that's one of your questions, or if that's, and I'm laughing, but you understand what I'm saying. That's one of the,
no, absolutely.
A form factor or, a lifestyle factor.
Absolutely. And I think you raise a really good point about that the systems that work well and are easy to use have been designed with the person in mind. They've been designed to be, to have the form factor like you mentioned, but the user experience is something that is positive. And I don't think that all of them are designed and created equally in that sphere. And so I think that there's some really great examples of that, and I would say that the Tandem is one of those that has an ease in use and an interface that, especially for anybody who's been diagnosed in the last few years, that's what they're used to in terms of a touch screen. And so, with that said, so it's a good question about the quiz. And one of the things that we did, just to quickly give you a little bit of history of it. So in we did a lot of work surveying over 1,500 adults with type 1, 700 adolescents, 700 parents of kids with type 1 to really understand what are the main questions that we need to ask people so that we can put them on the right path toward an experience where they become more aware about devices, and then also it maybe matches better to what their lifestyle is. And so we were able to take hundreds of questions and derive a quiz that has 5 questions in it. And a part of those questions is about the level of distress and burden that they perceive about diabetes, because we found that that's a really critical factor in making sure that people get the right kind of information about using devices. But we also ask them what their priorities are, what are their concerns, and what are their main ones. And although we don't specifically phrase it the way that you mentioned, it is that we get at a number of different priorities that people have, and then that starts them on this path. And then because of the way that it's framed, and as Laurel said around the algorithm, that it'll then take people to, based on their responses, it'll take them to individual stories of others who had those same concerns or same priorities. But then one of the parts that's not live on the website yet is a device readiness tool, device finder. And so in there, you can drill down a lot more deeply about what your priorities are. And so, for example, if someone really wants it to be discreet, if someone wants it really ease of use is one of the ones that we have in there as a priority. If someone really wants to avoid finger sticks, there's all of this that you can tailor the advice or the recommendations that you're going to get based on what your priorities are. So that's great for people who have some idea of what it is, but it's also great for people who are just trying to get a sense of, I'm not even sure what my priority is. I'm not even sure what I want out of this. So you can learn about it as well in the process.
All right. So I'm looking at the website, and I know that, as you said, more is coming, but it does say there's stuff about pump and smart pump. There are only 3 pumps in the U.S., as far as I know, right now. Which ones are the smart pumps? I almost said, which one are the dumb pumps? Sorry, I'll take that.
Right, exactly. There was something funny there that I couldn't quite come up with, but I do agree with you that what we found, and so this is why I think it's so important to ask people and involve them in user testing and in development. One of the things we found were that people really wanted to distinguish between something you just put on your body that administers insulin that doesn't have any kind of alteration, or it doesn't change what it's doing based on anything else. And so you program a pump, and they're sophisticated for, say, 1995. They haven't evolved a lot, but they still do a great job and are reliable and precise. What we wanted to distinguish is this idea that a pump can do something like low glucose suspend, or can be part of a larger closed loop system. And so the smart pump idea really came from what we heard from people. And although it's not an FDA category of devices, we really heard from people that they wanted something that distinguished between kind of the traditional way that you would pump versus something that has the capability to be within a closed loop system or to have low glucose suspend. So that was really the distinction there.
Got it. So in other words, if you use an Omnipod on its own, that's a pump. But if you use an Omnipod as part of the non-FDA approved loop with a Riley link, now you have a smart pump.
Exactly.
Okay. Laura, let me ask you. We talked about this at the very beginning, that one of the things that makes DiabetesWise unique and very, very helpful is that it is not put out by a company with a stake in what device people choose. The Helmsley Charitable Trust, I think many people are familiar with so much of what it has done for diabetes research and funding and grants. And we've talked to some folks from the Helmsley family on the show in the past. What was the purpose here? Why did Helmsley want to get involved? It seems really obvious because you're helping people, but I just wanted to ask you about the involvement here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, Stacey, the point that you raised about the fact that we are an independent entity really speaks to kind of the trust factor, not only in what Helmsley, because we don't have a financial stake in this, but we're also partnering with some of the leading diabetes researchers in the field at Stanford University. So we really want to ensure that we're supporting information that is unbranded and unbiased, and that people can trust. And I think, again, to underscore that this website is it's informed by people living with diabetes. It's their voices. And, for example, one of the tools that Korey mentioned, this device readiness tool, some of the research that's going into that is, from a sample of people with diabetes. So when people see, different priorities and, ratings as, kind of just a sneak peek into some of the features that are going to be coming out, those are actually based on input from people living with diabetes who are using DiabetesWise for the first time. So it's a really unfiltered, real view.
Korey, what's your hope for this? Do you hope that like a CDE would say, hey, let's sit down together and go through the quiz on DiabetesWise? Or is it a question of people just kind of thinking a little bit more? Or even people, what I find fantastic about this is that you have MDI on here as well. You're not assuming everybody wants an insulin pump. So I'm curious what your hope is going forward.
It's a great question, and I think that ultimately what we want to do is we want to be able to match a device with the person and their lifestyle and their interests and their priorities. And I think one way to do that is that we traditionally don't do a lot of in clinical care is to spend more time objectively figuring out what's going to be the best fit, because clinics are busy, providers are busy. It's hard to get that dialed down really closely. And so my goal really is to get the right one for the person. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And if people are using multiple daily injections and using a meter, I could argue most of the time that, add a CGM, add the Libre, add something that will give you a little bit more of glucose information to dial it in. So there's maybe a little bit of room, but if you don't want to move and you are really happy with it, then maybe there's some areas of distress related to diabetes that we've learned about in this process that we can help you with. And so, it's really intended to be a resource that can match and fit with anybody's interests and what they want to do around devices. But also, at a minimum, it educates the person about it. It also can be a resource that, like you said, CDEs could use. One of the things that we found really helpful is we went to AADE over the summer and in August in Houston, and one of the things that we learned and talked a lot about with CDEs was, how this could be a helpful tool for them. And so that's another thing that's in process, is making sure that we have something that can be used by them in a helpful way, so that they can also get people on the right devices. I mean, I think that everybody, if you get the right device on somebody and they use it effectively, everybody wins. There's less time involved on the clinical side. There are better outcomes. The person's happier. I think that there's just so many reasons that we want to do this. And then the other vision for this is that we keep it completely free, that we keep it disconnected from, or not connected, not tethered to any kind of device manufacturers. We need them. They have to be part of this, and they're doing great work, but we don't want to be, as Laurel said, we don't want to be biased or branded in any way. We want it to be free and an objective tool for people to use.
I'm curious, what do you mean by you need them for this?
Well, I mean, I think that we don't necessarily need them for DiabetesWise. Right. Although, I mean, you could argue that we wouldn't have DiabetesWise if we didn't have devices, but that's maybe getting a little
you need devices to pick a device.
Right, exactly. But I think I'm just noting that we need for, I think, the person with diabetes to have the best chance of the best outcomes, we need device companies who are pushing the edge and who are there's a healthy competition. And so I think it's good that they all exist and that they do the work. We just don't want we don't want people with diabetes to feel like they have to go to a certain device. And so that's why we created this, so that they could have a more, unbiased view of what's available.
I just didn't want to make sure, I just wanted to make sure I didn't misunderstand there, that you didn't need them, in other words, to give permission to recommend, or that they had to somehow sign off on DiabetesWise. Right.
Okay. Now we if we want to work with them on this and make sure that we have accurate information, but ultimately this is driven by us and our team and our collaborations. And so if there's something on there that isn't that they don't like, then, or a story that someone bashes their device, then it's still going to be on the website. But it's also that we appreciate that they've done a lot of work to bring us to this place where we can actually have these discussions and we can actually have options. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned when Benny was diagnosed, there were more pumps on the market. And while there are fewer now, at least the technology is improving. Before I let you go, Korey, could you speak just for a moment about where it's been for you and, where you are looking for it to go in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think that, I've been, as a little bit of background, I've been using Loop for over, I think, 2.5 years now. And I found a great deal of benefit from it. I mean, mainly on glucose control, but also on the mental side, and having longer chunks of time throughout the day where I don't think about diabetes, which is really nice. So for me, I've been really happy with the progression. It's not perfect, and there are still pieces, multiple pieces that you have to wear. We still have to stab ourselves with sharp pieces of metal. So there are a lot of these things that aren't going to go away, and I don't think are going to go away anytime soon. But I do think that the ability to put something on and to not pay much attention to it for a few days we're close to that. And I think that that's what is really appealing for me, and I think for others that we talk to, is that if we can just continue to decrease the amount of time that people have to think about it and they feel safe and feel like it's reliable, then that's really what we're aiming for. And I really do think that that's where we're moving in the next few years.
Laurel, let me give you kind of the last word here. What are your hopes for DiabetesWise and how it helps people?
I'm just pausing. So that's quite a big question. I hope. I think from the Helmsley standpoint, we want to make the information about diabetes devices and technologies available to everyone living with diabetes, no matter where they live in the U.S. A lot of times just information isn't accessible for people, and we want to make sure it's from a trusted source of information. And, if someone lives in rural America, for example, and they don't have access to support groups or an endocrinologist, that they can still connect with people like them to learn about the different technologies and devices and experiences of people that are navigating the same disease.
I'm thrilled that this is available. I really wish it was around when we were choosing our devices, because it was a little bit like throwing darts at a dartboard. And luckily, it worked out okay. Mm-hmm. But Korey and Laurel, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
More info about DiabetesWise on the episode homepage. And of course, the link is there to go ahead and take the quiz and tool around on their site and see what you think. Up next, what Marco Polo has to do with type 1. That's in our Tell Me Something Good. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. It's hard to think of something that's changed our diabetes management as much as the Dexcom Share and Follow apps. The amazing thing to me is how it's helped us talk less about diabetes. That is the wonderful thing about Share and Follow. As a caregiver, a parent, a spouse, you can help the person with diabetes manage in the way that works for your individual situation. Internet connectivity is required to access Dexcom Follow. Separate Follow app is required. You can learn more. Just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. It is time for Tell Me Something Good, and this one made me smile when I read it. Oh my goodness. So Rachel Holman shared a story. We were at Target today, and my son's low alert on Dexcom went off, and we heard in the distance, T1, I hear you, Marco. My boy lit up. Yes, you do. T1, Polo. Another kid pops up out of breath. And the two of them just chat for a few minutes about Legos or with everything in common. I melted. So how about that? I mean, we've heard some Dexcom alerts or seen somebody checking their blood sugar. And of course, I want to run over and, hey, how are you? And what are you doing? But I don't. I try to contain myself. But every once in a while, I'll say something. But I can honestly say it has never occurred to me to yell Marco and hope to hear back a Polo from a Dexcom alert. So kudos to these kids. And Rachel, thanks for letting us know about it. Any follow-up you have, we would love to find out. I mean, I can see her son doing this again, and maybe they became friends. I don't know. But I thought it was a really cute story. And if you try it and it works, let me know. I think the closest we ever came was, interestingly enough, at a hotel pool. Speaking of Marco Polo, this was years ago. We took a road trip to Chicago. That's a story in and of itself. We took an RV from Charlotte to Chicago, and we did 6 states in 5 days to go see Syracuse play in the NCAA tournament. Anyway, long story short, we did not bring the RV actually into Chicago. It would have been very expensive to do that. So rather than, pay a lot and find a place to park it, we parked our RV at my husband's friend's funeral home in Skokie outside of the city. and we Ubered in. But that's not what I wanted to tell you about. So we're at the hotel pool, and we look over, and there's a little girl with a Dexcom and an Omnipod on the backs of her arms. And of course, Benny, at that age, was willing to go say hi and be social. So he did, and we struck up a whole conversation, and they were so nice. It was a lot of fun. Sometimes those diabetes spottings in the wild really give you more than you'd expect. There's just something so rewarding and so affirming about knowing you're not the only one. I think as much for parents as for the kids. And someday I'll tell you more about our crazy road trips. We were on a quest as a family to try to hit all 50 states. And the kids were so excited about this when they were younger. I think we're on 27 or 28. I'd have to check. And I think I'm the only one who's still excited about trying to do it. Has to be all four of us together. You have to have feet on the ground. Airports do not count. And so feet on the ground, you can't drive through either. You have to actually get out and stop and take a picture. You need picture evidence. You don't have to have all four faces in the photo because sometimes people are grumpy and don't want to take pictures, but we need all four of us. So we have one or two pictures where everybody's holding up a cup of coffee or hot chocolate. That one was like at 6 a.m. in Ohio on that road trip. I have another one in Las Vegas where we're all holding up gelato and you can't see our faces. So I'm hoping this summer, not to get completely off track, to go to New England with the kids because we've got a lot of states to hit up there. Anyway, if you have a Tell Me Something Good story, it can be a road trip or anything of the kind, whatever works for you. You can send it to me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, or post it in the Facebook group, Diabetes Connections, the group, or send it to me on social media. It'll find its way to me. Just tell me something good. Keeping that busy schedule, which I'm actually having so much fun with. I'm going to Raleigh, North Carolina for the JDRF Type 1 Nation Summit this weekend, doing not only the world's worst diabetes mom presentation, but also my favorite one about making connections in real life, Diabetes Connections. I have been doing this talk since before the podcast came about. That's where the podcast got its name. And I'm also talking about social media. So I'm really excited to meet some new people right here in my state. And then in 2 weeks, I'll be in Maine for an event in South Portland, Maine. Busy calendar as I head out on the World's Worst Diabetes Mom book tour. And if you've got an event later in the year, things are still pretty busy, definitely through April. But after that, it slows down to about one event a month right now. So if you've got a JDRF summit, if you've got another event, especially in the fall, please let me know so we can plan for it. I would love to come and meet you. I can do those presentations. We can do a live podcast. We can just hang out and talk. It's always fun to meet new people, and I do love making those in real life connections. All right, coming up later this week, another mini episode where I'm taking on what I think is a pretty controversial topic. In fact, when I posted about this on my personal page recently, I was shocked at the response I got. I'm going to be talking about why I think it really is a bad idea to post pictures of your child in the hospital. Yeah, I know a lot of people do this, but it's just not good. So I'll be talking about that coming up on Thursday. In the meantime, thank you as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Simms, and I'll see you back here on Thursday.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.